and we therefore will move on to the next session, which is a natural continuum. It's about policy. How do we radically accelerate the path of change? We have programmed this section to take account of our relationship with AARP, i.e. America, which has come on stream over the past hour or so. And hopefully we have Stephanie Firestone, who is the Senior Strategic Policy Advisor for Health and Age-Friendly Communities at AARP International. Stephanie, are you there?
I am here. Can you see me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you. So I will disappear and turn the controls over to you.
Okay, let me see. I think I was just on. Let me see. Can you see me?
I did.
All right. Well, hopefully that will come back on. I'm not sure why I'm having. It looked like I was. Am I on now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon to some of you. So as Ian said, my name is Stephanie Firestone. I'm a Senior Strategic Policy Advisor with AARP. AARP is the largest nonpartisan nonprofit organization in the world with a social mission to enable people to choose how they live as they age. As you already heard from Nell and Nathan, the chairs of the TC314, Aging Societies is held by my colleague at AARP, Britta Berg. So AARP has been involved with ISO's work around aging societies since 2016, when ANSI invited us to join a strategic advisory group on aging societies that was chaired by BSI. Since then, Britta has chaired the TC314, and we've been engaged in the U.S. Mirror Committee throughout. So we're thrilled to see momentum around standardization focused on aging societies, and hope that today's workshop will just continue to strengthen those ties as the work of this group aligns with the work of TC 134. And I want to thank those for inviting me to participate in this, Ian and everyone. So AARP has worked with the Agile Aging Alliance since we invited Ian in 2017 to a transatlantic dialogue on multi-generational housing that we hosted with the German Marshall Fund of the US. I shared some of this work in AA's compilation, Neighborhoods of the Future. And we have continued to research in this space and connected with a variety of leaders in the built environment sector, city planners like myself, as well as architects and designers, developers and real estate professionals. This past December, we convened a transatlantic group of leaders, a number of whom are presenting today, to inform a set of guiding principles that we hope will be a call to action of sorts and a resource for professionals and decision makers. I'll say a few words about the principles, but first I just want to say a few things about where we are at today, and a few people have mentioned the nexus with COVID-19. So the pandemic has really illuminated, in particular in the United States and the UK, how our societies have systemically supported the creation of Class B citizens, people of color, immigrants, and older adults. We've done this in part by physically segregating people of different ages and backgrounds, and then essentially disinvesting in the places where they live. That's from physical concentrations of poverty to concentrations of older people in congregate settings, and then of course the younger people, often people of color, who are their healthcare providers. So these are the groups of people who are now disproportionately dying from coronavirus. The pandemic has told us in no uncertain terms that segregating people in society by age, race, ability, or ethnicity is a form of discrimination that has direct and substantial impact on health and longevity. So post-COVID, there's really an intense need for us to develop and implement a reintegration strategy. We need to radically accelerate the application of an age-friendly framework that addresses the disparities that we have created in society. That means building the foundations for a new, more equitable system of services and supports that's based on, that actually even draws strength from our homes and our communities. Our guiding principles for the built environment sector stress enabling design, which my colleague Esther Greenhouse, who's worked with me on drafting the principles, will talk about. Our recent convening in London with those experts I mentioned felt that the most housing is built the way it is today simply because it's been done that way for so long. And a few people, John Godfrey and Xavier from Grosvenor, a few people highlighted the importance of educating customers to demand the right sort of housing. And that is critical, but it's really up to us to demonstrate that we can do much better. It's up to us to demonstrate innovative designs based on the principle that living spaces should enable people of all ages and abilities across increasingly long lifespans. So we hope that the ISO standards development process will generate commitments from built environment influencers to providing leadership. In other words, going beyond standards to show colleagues a true vision and innovation in this space, and more importantly, to show that to the public and to educate the public. So the pandemic has also shown how critical it is that these design solutions provide broadband access and appropriate technologies. A number of people have talked about that, so that everyone can readily access telehealth, which has had a huge acceleration during this time, and also promote remote learning and work and social engagement. Everyone should be able to access those. So in order to properly address the needs of disadvantaged residents and alleviate some of the disparities, we have to prioritize the creation and maintenance of enabling built environments in disproportionately impacted communities. The principles talk about the need to use housing in communities as a tool to advance these and other broad societal agendas. This means rethinking our planning and eliminating outdated zoning and other regulatory barriers. It means living environments that facilitate engagement across the generations, because this provides mutual benefits and enables people to continue contributing to society at any age. Ageism was mentioned a few times today. Having the opportunity to regularly engage with people of all ages in many contexts of daily life will also help to combat ageist stereotypes that are really endemic to our societies. And using housing and communities to advance societal agendas necessitates having appropriate financing models and products. These need to be in place. This means financial tools need to view lifelong living environments as an asset, and that they facilitate the kinds of investments in the housing stock and communities that enable independence over a long lifespan. Finally, a few of the people earlier mentioned the global community's commitment to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. AARP co-chairs the UN Stakeholder Group on Aging, which succeeded in getting age and references to aging, that kind of language, in 13 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But still, much of the local through global work advancing the SDGs still fails to fully address the major demographic change of population aging. It often treats these as separate issues. So as the world prioritizes these global goals, we need to tap existing efforts that are advancing SDGs as opportunities in a post-COVID-19 world to regenerate and retrofit our built environment assets using this idea of a lifelong equity lens. So my hope is that the emerging standard will properly address disparities in health outcomes, address our overburdened formal healthcare infrastructures and failing long-term care models, and existing housing community models that fail to facilitate at-home care services and supports. And most importantly, as Sam Mauger and Jeremy Porteous and a few others mentioned, we need to be sure that the lived experience of older adults is central to and informing the process at every stage. So as this ISO process unfolds, AARP can engage with both the process as well as internally in our organization so that our livable communities work will both inform and be informed by the emerging standard.
Well, you crammed a lot into that, Stephanie, indeed. I love the lifelong equity span. I think that's really great. You talked a little less about planning than I maybe anticipated, because I know that's your passion and I know that it's a critical part of the equation. But fortunately, the next speaker will talk about planning, and we'll come back to you, if we may, with the Q&A in a short while. So Richard Blythe, who is Head of Policy at the Royal Town Planning Institute, will talk from a UK perspective, but in a broader context, because we have planning, you've got zoning, and they're not a million miles removed. So, Richard, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I can see you.
Great. Yes, well, I suppose it's probably going to be mainly from an England perspective, because we have different policies in each country in the UK. And I tend to know most about the England one. From the whole of today, we've seen very much that the need for multi-generational neighbourhoods and the quality of our neighbourhood is a hugely important question as a consequence of the virus. Everyone is thinking about what their neighbourhood is like, people spending more time in them. I should say, what the RTPI is. It's the professional body for town planners in the UK. We also have about 1,500 members outside the UK. And we are linked with organisations such as the European Council of Town Planners and the Global Planners Network. So we're accustomed to discussing these kind of issues across the planet. One of our tasks is to do research, and we have long been the champion of compact settlement patterns. Our research shows that compact, medium density, mixed use and transit friendly settlements encourage physical activity, continuous through life, and continuous economic participation and social interaction into older age. So what works for older generations is really the kind of thing that works for everybody. To show an example of sort of where planning comes into this and why it's so critical and why you've got it on the agenda for today, I've found an example of a project for the creation of 200 assisted living units for over 55s in northwest England, divided from the village that it's nominally next to by a busy main road, a trunk road. This was refused by the local planning authority, and it was taken to planning appeal, and the government inspector dismissed the appeal because she said that the proposal would create an isolated enclave for older people, which was not satisfactory and would be difficult for the residents to reach all the facilities in the village. So that just shows you the kind of cutting edge, sort of boots on the ground aspect of the principles that we've been discussing today in one area. So I suppose the issue for planners really is, can the desire for multi-generational neighbourhoods, great though it is, be turned into policy? And as you pointed out, Ian, the way that policy works in the UK is through a process of establishing policy locally in local plans and then looking at applications for development against those policies. The policy is complicated because we also have national policy, and the government in England produced new national guidance in 2019 specifically on older people. It is problematic because it, to a certain extent, continues a sort of way of looking at the world which regards older people's housing as a separate thing, and it doesn't particularly talk about how you might create neighbourhoods for multi-generations, which I think in the context of today is a pity. And it also has to be operated against the very difficult background we have of counting housing numbers. So you may know that what drives planning policy in England is the number of planning permissions. And while there is some exhortation to evaluate the need for the number of houses needed in different age categories and also different kinds of housing, ultimately the really critical point is the sheer numbers of them. That is what drives local authorities. The second issue for planners, I think, is how national and local states can use their own resources to create multi-generational neighbourhoods. So on the one hand, there's a question of determining planning permissions made by private sector proposers. The other question is, the government owns an enormous amount of land, especially if you add to the government, local government. And also we have a body called Homes England, which is the government's housing regeneration and delivery agency. So how are they using their policies to create multi-generational neighbourhoods? I can't answer that question at the moment. As regards to local authorities, we have evaluated and assessed the extent to which local authorities have been using their own resources to spearhead housing development. I don't just mean council housing, I mean all kinds of development. And we found in that study that local authority-led projects are providing housing specifically for older people in 42% of cases, which is encouraging. One of the things that's been driving local authorities is frustration with the rate of completions in the private sector-led development. It's not meeting the targets. So local authorities have taken matters into their own hands to a certain extent. So finally, what is the Royal Town Planning Institute doing? We produced a groundbreaking guide on dementia and town planning 3 years ago, which we're already updating now. We're producing practice advice for older people's housing in consultation with the Chartered Institute of Housing, ARCO and the Centre for Ageing Better. That will be out at the end of this year. We're producing wider practice advice on sort of healthy communities altogether, particularly in the light of the current crisis. And actually, going back to how we opened this morning, we've just produced a module on our learning platform on how to bring the Sustainable Development Goals into planning practice. So even in the kind of specific areas of dementia, but generally, one of the things we've noticed is that, as I said at the beginning, that planning for one group in society tends to mean that all groups in society will benefit from it. And a key denominator at the moment is, are we trying to produce a 15-minute neighbourhood or a 30-minute neighbourhood? But I think most people would now agree that for all parts of society, we want to create neighbourhoods where you can reach what you need easily without having to get into private motorised transport to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I have one very brief numeric question, and that is, a year or so ago, Victoria was telling me that age-friendly environments and neighborhoods was a priority for your organization. How would you say, in the order of 1 to 10, you've progressed over the past year? Do you see progress in regard to planning, taking account of the needs of an aging population?
Well, I think that question is unpicking, because you started talking about our organisation and then you started to talk about planning, which is an activity with a large number of different agents in it.
From your perspective?
Well, June 2019 was the guidance on older people's housing from the government. As I say, I don't see particular reference in government policy to multi-generational housing as a government priority. So in that sense, no. But on the other hand, there hasn't been any evolution in government policy in the last 12 months. So I suppose it's probably more rewarding to look and see what individual people have been trying to achieve on the ground. So an event such as today's is quite useful, because you've been hearing from promoters of particular kinds of schemes and ideas have actually been coming saying, well, we're doing this almost without asking permission first. And that one of the great ways of using an event like this is that then that can be picked up and copied by others.
Fantastic, thank you very much. If you'll hang around for the Q&A, talking of innovation, we're going to turn to Nick Palmarini, who is the director of the National Innovation Centre for Ageing here in the UK, except he's not here in the UK, he's actually in America at the moment. Nick, can you tell us what you are up to, please?
Ian, do you hear me?
I do hear, not see, but I will see, I'm sure, in a sec. I see you.
Okay. Hey, nice to see you. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm in Boston and flying back to UK hopefully next Monday. So thank you for inviting me. Ian is such a good chat. Heard a lot of good stuff. So I'll try to squeeze as much as I can what I'd like to share with you guys. So just one first thing, I worked with IBM Research till October 2019 at this point. I was the AI lead for ethics at the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab, and I was leading inside IBM Research, the AI for healthy aging practice, which for the last 10 years was caring about innovation and aging. And I left a fantastic team of colleagues to reach a new team of fantastic colleagues within the National Innovation Centre for Aging, which is located in Newcastle upon Tyne, the north of England. And the work we're doing there is just try to combine some of the discussion we heard along the day-to-day about how we can translate some of these opportunities that we have on one side and the challenges, obviously, that we all see in something actionable and practical for the organization and the market, so that we can prove that behind these, stories of the so-called longevity economy that we all heard about, there is something tangible. Because if we're able to make the economic wheel to spin, I think that we can have a fallback over the population from several perspectives. So I'll try to frame what I'm going to say on three main areas. The first one is, let me say, we already have discussed it quite a lot today, but I think we all agree in this session that it's going to take a new kind of village. So we have to make a heavy societal change, which is still in progress. I mean, it's not achieved, and I guess that we have so many proof, and COVID highlighted many of these proof. And I think I tend to agree with Sam, what she was talking about before, on reframing the concept of who are the older adults today, because we've been through a narrative that it's leading us on the keywords of disposable or frail as top of the narration as soon as the COVID took the stage around the older adults. Also, I would like to suggest to keep very well separated the concept of accessibility and the concept of older adults and aging. I've been the accessibility leader in my early career in IBM, so I'm talking about before 2010, and that was leading me from accessibility to aging in a sort of a natural progress with, let me say, the big mistake I did myself, believing there was so much overlapping. Yes, there is an overlapping, in certain stages of life and certain condition of our life. But these are two very different narratives, also in terms of standard. And I also always tended to call, since I learned it pretty quickly in UK, what I call the Daniel Blake paradox, in which you are a perfectly able person to try to achieve what you can, and it's the system that is not allowing you to be part of what you could achieve. And in the movie Daniel Blake, that I hope you have the chance to watch, you realize even with your best intentions, sometimes it's not a matter of digital divide. It's a matter of a system which is not even able to bring you to fight the digital divide. So digital divide is even in the background. The second thing I would like to talk about this new kind of village, it's about the fact of for who are we designing. I think that we should have to be aware there is a new demographic out there, and I think we should have to be very careful in considering them as a basket where everybody fill in. We should have to be respectful of the diversity so that everyone, when it's 64 and 365 days is an individual, and the day after that is a retired person become a sort of a magma where everybody is the same. I think it's a huge mistake, as well as thinking that this entity is alone out there. I think we have to start thinking that we're designing not only for older adults, but even for their stakeholders, because paradoxically, we can start designing things not for the older adults, but even or mainly for the stakeholders. What we do at the center is that we're designing first with the older adults. We have a community of people that we involve naturally inside whatever process we do. So co-design is a part of our daily business. So we're designing with them and not only for them. So I think it's another key point that leads us to, I think, another clarification that we should have to do. It's not multi-generational, in my opinion, it's cross-generational, because I think it's the interaction between this generation, which is not just multi, but it's just collaborating one with the other that could lead us to design this new kind of village. The second area, which I really would like to point quickly, but it's more deeper than the previous discussion, is about the fact that the knowledge will power new solutions. I think that we are obviously in a time of data. I think we all realize about them. So what does it mean dealing with data and older adults? In my experience, in the past 10 years, I work heavily on the concept of behavioral footprint of the individual. So what we can understand about ourselves through data. And let me tell you that there is a lot of literature that is coming up, also powered by the progresses of technology. I would say it's machine learning on top of everything, because it allows us to start giving a meaning to data that was so complex before. And there has been practices pretty, let me say, well established in some area, since we're talking about homes, about how we can understand the data in the home so that we can then understand better the people who are living in that space. That established already some rules. The AAL, so the ambient assisted living, already showed us how could be the protocols and how complex these protocols could be. Also, the growth of type of devices. Just let me mention, for example, the work that Dina Katabi is doing here at the MIT with a solution called Emerald, which is leading us to a scenario in which we don't have to deploy tons of sensors to understand what's happening, but we can just use one that it's overlooking all what's happening in the home, not to mention the LiDAR technology, or not to mention, let me say, one standard which is coming quite quickly on top, and I think we should have to consider in the ISO, which is the audio analytics, so what we can get from the data listening and the voice. So combination of these two factors, and I don't want to mention the obvious players like Amazon and Google, is helping us to understand a lot more about what's happening with just one source of data, which leads us to one point that has been touched before about the ethics. So we can't think that there is artificial intelligence without data, and there is no data without an ethics. I guess this is very important. So we should have to start thinking, when we talk about standards, about the trusted AI, so a concept of the trusted AIs, which means fairness, explainability, robustness, assurance. So we have to understand how an algorithm works, and not to fall in the classic explanation like the EULA when you just sign a contract. But let me say, there's something that we have to start doing now to make explainable this technology, because the risk of the control over the so-called IoT, it's pretty there. And let me tell you, it's affecting one slice of the population, which are women, that typically has issues and are under the control of others who are setting the technology, which still remains in the literature, in the narrative, but also in reality, something controlled by men. So I think there is a lot that we should have to care about. Let me say, a broader concept of ethics related to older adults, which I think also is missing as a principle. We are full of ethical principles in dealing with healthcare solutions. So think about all the processes that they are following now to find a vaccine for the COVID. All the protocols there for the ethical treatment of this data is very clear. It's absolutely not clear what are the ethical principles around older adults, since if you see the best constitution in the nations of this planet still don't have the word age as a discrimination, while it is. Okay, so it's not clearly stated in many of the constitution that age has to be considered as a discrimination like sex or religion, as is clearly stated in many of these constitutions. And we're doing some work on this space at the center in order to highlight what could be the space. Let me tell you that this process of understanding true day-to-day behavior could lead us to a scenario where instead of having only a reactive type of care like is today, something happened, I do something, we can start understanding what could be a proactive care system, so we can start understanding before things to happen, to then lead us to what we can call a sort of a concept of optimized care, so that we can suggest things before they happen in order not them to happen, so that we can help people to thrive and grow in the processes and the different stages of life, let me say in an informed way, powered by the knowledge in the background. The last point I just wanted to highlight is that scalability and customizations needed to coexist. So there is no way to have this discussion made if we're not trying now in the stage of our modernity and the capability that we have available today to bring it forward in a sort of a scalable way. And I think we are full of example on how we can bring it forward in a scalable way. And scalability and customization are not one against the other, as must be a combination of this factor, because I think that we tended to work on the concept of simplification on one hand, but we forgot about personalization, which I think still is the key things that we should have to achieve. We would like to have personalized solution because we start to be, let me say, used and aware about the fact that we are different. We have our own dignity, desire, and not only needs. And we would like to receive personalized information. I think it's time to try to see it from this perspective, which also bring the fact that now we can theoretically deliver a solution to a broader population, try to fight one key point that we have in the background, which is inequalities. So we can't keep on thinking all the progresses of this technology if you don't try also to fight inequalities. And one way to do it is just to create an economic system in the background that is sustainable enough to lower the price of the technology and make it more accessible to all the people. My 4 easy takeaway for this discussion. First of all, there is no single organization that can solve this issue, so there is no one player. So we have to work together, and that's why I think standards could bring back on a discussion that it's putting all us together, because we can see from the several different dimensions. Second, customized, relevant content and services are essential. So I think it's important that we start thinking that we have to act on the customization of the content, which leads me to my third point, that personalization takes priority over simplification. So let's try to, yes, make things simple, but without try to make it too generic, because if we do so, and I guess we all have these experiences, we realize people don't want it because it's just not for me. It's for everybody except me. Finally, scalability is the brass ring. if we're not able to design a scalable solution, I think we're losing the opportunity to really make the change of my first point, which is going to take a new kind of village. And I think we all have to be part of it.
I guess that's you done. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes. End. That was excellent as ever. Scalability, customization, personalization, proactive care system that will actually lead to preventative measures. Really, really insightful. Thank you. And we'll have some questions for you in a moment. I'm going to now turn to Mayrid and Carol, who's the Associate Director for Residential Standards at RICS, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. We've been working together, last year to inform the development of the reference framework for age-friendly housing, which has evolved into this ISO opportunity. So I do believe that Mayred has some technical issues, may not be able to use her video, but you can hear me, and can we hear you?
I hope so, Ian. I'm definitely having some technical issues with broadband this morning or this afternoon, which the chat about technology was fascinating in that respect. I think technology is great as long as you have the broadband to support it. Yes, as Ian mentioned, I work for RICS, and we are a globally recognised professional body where everything we do is designed to affect positive change in the built and natural environments. And confidence through respected global and enforced by over 130,000 qualified and trainee professions across the built and natural environment. And one of the things I'm going to cover is a little bit about how standards work for RICS and how a similar approach could be potentially adopted for multi-generational housing. So our development enforcement of leading international standards protects consumers and businesses by ensuring that the utmost level of professionalism is enjoyed across the built and natural environment. And we've been doing this for an awful long time. Our standards documents lay out the ethical, conduct and competence related standards for the profession. So our profession is chartered surveyors and a range of other people associated around surveyors. So we also cover estate agents. And if you are in the UK, you may have seen our logo in estate agents across the country. By working to our standards, professional members and RICS regulated firms deliver confidence and transparency. And what we do is we ensure that these standards are upheld by the profession through our system of independently led regulation. So one of the things to think about in terms of developing any new form of standard for generational communities or any kind of framework is actually how do you ensure that that standard is maintained and upheld. And for us, for RICS, that system of independent-led regulation is essential to the work that we do. And we actually have an approach which is quite public in many respects, where we do actually name and shame those firms who have breached our standards, and that information is available on our website. So I think one of the challenges with standards is actually, yes, in setting that framework and developing that system for people, is how do you then use that framework to provide a degree of public confidence in what you're doing and what you're looking to do. So as a global standard setting organisation, we see the value in setting out a framework that provides clarity for professionals working in a set field and also for the public who are accessing their services. And as a global body, we also are able to ensure that we take the best practice from other countries and use it to learn and improve the work that we do. And I think one of the earlier speakers was talking about actually how you can ensure that you don't just end up with a Western standard, with something that just comes from the culture of one country or one area of practice. And actually, that's one of the interesting things about, looking at global standards, is how you can ensure that they can be responsive and adaptable across different geographies. When we develop our standards, we work with a range of stakeholders. And this can include government bodies, sector groups, consumer groups, legal experts, topic experts. We aim to consult widely, ensure that the profession is engaged, that our profession is engaged. And depending on this standard, this can take 8 months or even years before the final version is agreed and signed off. I think that's another area to think about, is the length of time that something can take to develop, and actually how long you want to spend on doing that. Because actually, if you're thinking about this now, and the chats that we've had, I've talked to you, I've talked to a number of people in this field for a long time, and we know that there's something that there is a degree of urgency. So actually, how can we develop a framework that actually is able to be adopted relatively quickly, so we don't end up spending several years trying to develop that framework, that standard, and actually missing out on an opportunity there. As Ian mentioned, last year we had a forum with the Agile Ageing Alliance and a range of other experts on age-friendly housing and the potential to develop a reference framework that could support the development of new age-friendly housing, and also the retrofitting of existing stock. And this is one of the real challenges, is actually the development of new housing and new frameworks. I think is an awful lot easier than actually how you retrofit, how you look at existing homes and existing communities. And I think what we are at, hopefully we're at a tipping point where actually we are ready to see and to change our perception about how we look at age-friendly housing. And I think I was talking about my personal experience of working for a housing association. One of the key challenges we faced with regards to age-friendly housing was actually how it was perceived by the potential occupants, especially sheltered housing. We provided sheltered housing for people who were over 55 years and over, and however, the average 55-year-old, indeed the average 65-year-old and 75-year-old, would have rather stayed in their own home, even if it was no longer suitable for their needs. The feeling that sheltered housing was something for someone much older than they were, despite their age. And I think this has been picked up by previous speakers, and I think whatever standards or whatever framework is developed, it really needs to be done in consultation with the people who are going to live in those communities. It really needs to be done in a way that actually engages actively with those communities, so that you're actually creating something, a place where people want to live. And I think one of the difficult things that we've seen with the COVID-19 outbreak is that what that pandemic has led to in terms of people who live in care and residential care homes, and that fear that we have for their safety. And I think fear is a very strong emotion, and I think what we want to do is be able to create communities in which people do not have any form of fear. And I think hopefully COVID will actually help us see a catalyst in how we think about how different generations can live together going forward. And I think, at the moment we have multi-generational communities. I live in a multi-generational community. However, it's not necessarily set out to be a multi-generational community. And I think what we can think about in terms of our standards or any kind of framework is actually how we can use them to think about what that multi-generational community of the future could look like, but also thinking about how we can then improve the communities that we already have, so that they can be brought up to a point where actually they are able to meet the needs of the people who are living in them. I think the bell went, so I stopped.
Thank you very much. There was a second bell coming your way, so comes in there, but that's absolutely fine. And you are right. I have a question for you. You talked about if you were creating the standard, what's your perspective in relation to a collaborative approach? Because obviously there are many standards organizations, and we as the Agile Ageing Alliance have worked closely with your organization. We've worked closely with the European Commission and various other organizations, including BSI, that have their own specific approach to standards, albeit they're part of ISO. What's your view in relation to a more collaborative approach?
I think collaborative approaches can work. I think they're worthwhile considering. I think there's always going to be a challenge where you have to, where there might be a leader organisation, and I say this as somebody who's working on a collaborative document at the moment, how you make sure you bring everybody together and how you do it in a way that everybody feels that their voices are being heard. And I think that it's always going to be a challenge, but I think collaboration can work. I think especially if you're bringing together a range of sector experts in their field who really know what they are doing and what they're looking to do.
Thank you. Let me put that question to the rest of the panel. I mean, we are talking about policy here, and we're talking about collaboration, but we're talking about cross-border collaboration. And what's your take on that? I mean, is it possible to work together across borders, regional, national, to any effect? You
Well,
could
it's
show me a hand.
The European Union, which we've just left, has a huge amount of emphasis on environmental standards. But one of the things that always struck me when I was working in the civil service was that there's no standards for people, not in this area. I mean, there are things like workplace safety, but there was no standard, for example, that housing should be affordable and provided across the European Union. So it's interesting which bits get the standards and which bits tend to be more grey and less firm.
I'll just add to that.
Yeah.
Ian, I'll just add, going back to my comment, and somebody else had also mentioned the beyond standards concept of innovation. So while there might be a certain standard that we can all reach collaboratively, I think that the way I see that standard is as a minimum versus the need for within each political context and policy context, each country and at the local level need to individualize based on their context. And I think that's where the really interesting innovation is where it happens, in my opinion.
Nick, let me ask you a question from a perspective of collaboration across sectors, but slightly differently from the public sector and indeed academic and corporate, because you've come from the IBM environment, you've been working in the States, and now you're working in the UK in the public sector. How do you think a standard could do you think that a standard, an ISO, a global standard, could really make a difference? And if I were to ask you in terms of incremental steps, because I think you implied it can't all be done at once, and when it can't, let's face it, what would be your lowest hanging fruit if you think this, well, I know you think it's positive, that's why you're here, but what would be a low hanging fruit for you to move the conversation forward to actually get to something of substance that reflects the interest in the event? Let's face it, we've got a huge interest from around the world. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, many thoughts. First of all, standards, I think, helps a lot the industries to then progress, because when you give standards, then you give a certain, process of rules so that industry can rely on them. From, let me say, a business perspective. From an application perspective, it's exactly one of the main issues that we all know about, setting the standards and then having institutions that respect the standards and apply the standards, which is the other side of the apple. And I guess we all know what I'm talking about. For example, if you talk about web standards, where you have countries that are forcing public organization and private organization to follow some accessibility rules, and then it's very hard to be compliant with these rules for many reasons. Culturally, because we still are not ready to start from, let me say, a more accessible web, if we're talking about accessibility, and practically because it's a cost. So we have to show always the opportunity of applying to the standards. But just to come to your question, I think the fastest way to have a system of standards put in place is to involve the industries, because if you involve the big players in the game, then it's easier to have, let me say, an advocacy towards institutions that should have to deliver the standards. And it's always been more or less this way. If you think about the W3C or other standards, right now you have several companies, I would say the big players that are setting the rules for the ethics in artificial intelligence. All they agreed to be in a consortium, and if you see the brands, you realize that only if the brands put together themselves, then you can deliver what could be a standard in developing a trustable artificial intelligence, for example. So I think the involvement of corporation is crucial to allow us to speed, because we need their advocacy. Now, their advocacy sometimes could be perceived as a way of guiding, how the standard should be to be compliant with the technology they have. That's why you need experts on the table on the other side, which are able to mitigate what is the best way when a standard could be compliant on existing technologies, if we talk about technologies for 1 second, which I think it's a way, the traditional way, but always be proved to be somehow efficient, that allow us then finally to deliver standards that are acceptable by the market because somehow are validated by the industry. So that's a fast way to proceed, and somehow it's feasible. One thing I guess we're talking in this specific case is not necessarily software standards, which are obviously part of the discussion, but obviously there are some design standards. Now we are touching, I think, a delicate point here, because if we go back to this idea of the diversity of this demographic, we should be able not only to work on standards of the, so-called universal design, but let me go back to that point I was trying to highlight before about the customization and personalization. We're talking about the home. We're talking about the place where you're going to live. We're talking about when you wake up in the morning, you want to see something nice ahead of you, and not something that could resemble like a hospital room. Okay, so I think that there is an interesting challenge here for designers to design with the users in a, I would say, more contemporary way, that it's not only following the practicality, the form, follow, function, as it was, let me say, some years before. But then, since we can embed the technology inside objects, I think that there is an interesting opportunity to set standards for a new class of objects that also follow some design principle. Because you told about my background. Yes, I was working in the United States. I've been in UK now, but I'm Italian. So I'm very, very interested in how we can develop something which is also beautiful, because it has to deal with our personality and our diversity. Only if we go that way, and trust me, there's a huge marketing opportunity there that design companies still haven't caught, that could lead us to design something completely innovative and diverse, I would say, to attract this population. So there is a business beside housing, which is the business of furniture, that we tended to forget.
Superb. That's a great cue for the next session.